Welcome back. South Africa's agricultural sector has more than doubled in value and volume terms since 1994. This success has been linked to international trade. At the same time, there's a growing call for greater financing of Africa's agriculture sector in order for it to play a transformative role in reducing hunger across the continent by improving food production and transforming the continent's food systems. For more on this, we are joined by Wandile Sihlobo, who's a chief economist at Agbiz, as well as Ben Leaka, who is the CEO of the African Agriculture Council. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Wandile, I'm going to kick off with you here because we've just come out of FOCAC in early September. And upon his return, President Cyril Ramaphosa was urging, or rather calling for, better quality of trade with China. But before we get into the trade dynamics of each particular country in China and China in this particular case, let's talk about what you're seeing when you look at the African continent's productivity from an agricultural perspective. What does data show us?
I think we still have a major improvement that we have to undergo as the continent when it comes to agricultural productivity. It's an important thing that the political leadership are talking about deepening trade with China, but I think only now few countries can benefit on such, like South Africa and perhaps maybe some of the countries in the northern regions of the continent. But if you look broadly within particularly the sub-Saharan Africa region, I would say agricultural productivity remain pedestrian in many countries. And what I think we need to do, particularly linked with the conversations that were had by political leadership of the continent in China, is thinking about what technologies can we bring into the African continent to try to boost the productivity at a farm level. And secondly, some of the things that can be done by the politicians in the continent to make the environment more ripe and attractive for investments, which may involve even some public infrastructure, like ensuring that the roads are in a good condition, thinking about the policies that are being placed every now and then by the governments that sometimes drive away investments, such as interference in the prices of commodities, are some things that we need to look at. And lastly, being more open to science to say, let's embrace better cultivars and genetical improvements in livestock. And I think those are some of the things that we need to think about, because only when we have productivity and the volume can we begin to talk about trade.
Ben, having listened to what Wandile has just mentioned now in terms of where we sit regarding productivity, what's your sense of the agricultural side on the continent? And I suppose as well, the conversations that came out of FOCAC as it relates to agriculture?
No, absolutely. And thank you very much for having me. I agree absolutely with what my colleague Wandile has said. It's very difficult to speak of trade between Africa and the rest of the world when we can barely produce enough for ourselves. So we need to look at what is needed on the African continent before we can start talking about trade. It's well and good to put in place measures that will allow us to trade with China, that will allow us to trade with the EU and the US and the rest of the world. However, what are we doing on the African continent to increase our productivity? What are we doing to support our small and medium-scale farmers? What are we doing to encourage investments in the necessary infrastructure that will allow us to pick up our productivity? So all those factors have to be looked at very carefully before we go on a goose chase and start looking for trade partners. Are we feeding our people enough? Are we creating opportunity for local businesses to increase productivity, to feed ourselves? Then with any excess, then we can start trading across the world.
So I'm going to stay with you, Ben, just on some of the things that you mentioned. I mean, I understand your organization, you promote the development of African agriculture. You want to facilitate that investment into bankable projects. But before we talk about how you facilitate that investment, talk to me about what we are getting right and what we're not getting right as it relates to some of the things that are needed to drive that productivity that you speak of.
Well, for one, we are seeing policy reforms across the continent. And I'm sure Wandile will speak about that more than I do, because you are seeing a number of countries at the level of national government, provincial government, even at the level of the African Union, that are encouraging policy reforms that will create that conducive environment for private sector investment. The challenge that we're facing is the implementation. So we're very good at drafting policies. We're very good at putting together documents, but the implementation becomes one of the biggest challenges that we are facing. When we speak to policymakers, when we speak to various ministries of agriculture, they have all these beautiful documents that speak of their vision and their mandates to develop the local agriculture. But when it comes to implementation, and that's what drives the private sector, that's what drives private sector investment. And unfortunately, those are some of the constraints that we're still seeing on the African continent. Implementation of relevant policies that will attract private sector investment.
Wandile, let me come to you here, because I think on many platforms, you and I have had lots of discussions around policy, and we always get the sense that the idea of beautiful documents and coming up with policies is a South African thing, but implementation isn't something that we do quite right. And it's quite interesting to hear Ben see similar, I suppose, call it patterns across the continent as well. What's your take on the policy reform side? Are there things that we are actually getting right, perhaps since the last time you and I spoke, which was probably like 6 months ago or so?
Absolutely. I would say, and what we need to do really when we're thinking about the continent, we usually go out to Europe and the other parts of the world to learn about what are they doing right to get their agricultural sector progressing. But this time around, we also do have examples within the African continent. Take South Africa, for example. I mean, you made the point at the start of this conversation that the sector has more than doubled in value and in volume terms since 1994. You look at what is it that is happening in South Africa that perhaps maybe in the continent we have to get it right. I think the first part for me, that does not cost capital, and it's not really bringing any fiscal weight to some of the governments, is really saying, look, let's be open to all of the better seed cultivars that many multinational businesses may be able to bring to the continent. Why am I repeating this point? I'm repeating this point because if you look at Southern Africa as we speak today, countries like Zimbabwe, Malawi, and the others have millions of people that will fall into hunger because of the recent drought that we have had. Yet, if you look into South Africa, having felt the similar drought, but they still remain at a net exporting side of the maize. What has given South Africa resilience is really this issue of embracing technology. And the governments there, they don't need to spend anything, but rather just open up on a regulatory side and say, okay, if it's safe and sustainable and friendly for the environment, then let's try to see how do we adopt that. That is the one part. But as you also go to China and the other parts and raising all of the capital and talking into all of these forums, let's begin to going back to the basics in Africa and making sure that we get the public infrastructure right. Because without that, whatever we will do, the transaction costs will still be very high, and you will have these fragmented agricultural value chains that in the end make it very difficult for farmers to be sustainable. And I think for me, infrastructure and embracing science are the first step that you do then. And the other important point I will close on with here, and I know it gets to be controversial and sometimes even boring because we talk about it so many times. But the point is that roughly
we seem to have lost Wandile's connection, and we'll try and reestablish it as he was about to make that final point, which he described as a little bit boring and perhaps controversial. But we're going to get to Ben. Ben, you may have caught a little bit of what Wandile was saying, and I want to go back here to what I spoke about in terms of what your organization does. What sort of success have you been seeing, or sort of wins, when it comes to facilitating that investment into bankable projects?
Well, the first thing is we are seeing quite a lot of interest from international development financial institutions, and that's our first win. The AAC, through its various partners and platforms, were able to develop the DFI Forum, which brings together global DFIs together to look at opportunities on the African continent. But when we look at opportunities on the African continent, we're not just limited to engaging with the private sector and understanding the challenges and needs for tailor-made financial instruments that are fitted for the African market, but also interacting with government, understanding the needs. And as Wandile said, you cannot develop agriculture without looking at science, without looking at infrastructure. So when you look at the African Development Bank, for example, special agro-industrial processing zone programs, these are mega programs that will bring about infrastructure development, that will bring processing plants, that will bring an entire ecosystem of agriculture, in addition to capacity building programs that will encourage and drive African community. So these are the types of opportunities that we're looking at, and you can see the interest from multinational agribusinesses. All they need is a conducive environment. All they need is to be able to negotiate and interact with government, but also for our policymakers and our political leaders to start looking at some of the basic challenges that need to be addressed in order to facilitate that flow of capital in the African on the African continent.
Right. Wandile, I'm going to come back to you here because we lost you just as you were about to make that final point, which you described as either boring or controversial. And we like controversial, so I don't think it's going to be boring. But do reiterate your point, or at least try and get to it.
Absolutely. I think the key thing really that we need to confront as the continent is that the problem of weak land rights is a really a big issue, because about 80% of rural farmland in the African continent actually has no formal title deeds or any strong tenure security that is in it. And I think without ensuring that we address that problem, when we're thinking about medium to large scale farmers that will produce sufficient volume to enable the continent to participate more strongly in global agricultural trade, that will continue becoming an issue for me. And I think that underscoring the points that Ben has made, adding also the fact that we address the land rights at the same time, will be some of the key levers that will enable us to make progress. And why am I revisiting this point? I'm revisiting this point because at the end of the day, you need private sector capital to actually be able to drive Africa.
Right. Ben, I want to come back to the point you were making around this interest that you're seeing from DFIs and potential investors. When you consider some of the, call it concerns that Wandile has mentioned, the one here which he talks about weak land rights, are those some of the risks that perhaps the DFIs or the potential investors are looking at as well? I mean, what are some of the risks or concerns they may have, even though they do have that interest to want to plug in investment?
Oh, absolutely. I'm from the DRC, and this is one of the key topics that's been discussed across various political channels, various public forums. How do we protect the inheritance of our people while opening up opportunities for foreign capital? And these are conversations that have to take place. These are topics that have to be discussed in consultation with the private sector. We're obliged to be protected by government in terms of the land rights. But when you're talking about massive investments into agriculture, the land issue will always come up, particularly when you're looking at multinational stakeholders that want to set up shop on the African continent. Land issue will always come up. And as Wandile said, this might be a controversial topic, but we do believe that with the platform that the African Agri Council has provided, for example, we can open up these conversations. We can have these conversations so that we can find mutually beneficial solutions that will not only look after or facilitate the development of African agriculture, but also look at the interests of the foreign capital that we are trying to attract on the continent.
Wandile, I mean, you mentioned in one of the notes that you've written that there is room for more ambitious export efforts as it relates to South Africa. If that is the case, what's holding South Africa back?
I mean, look, China is an important market when we were thinking about that. This is a country that spends just over $200 billion importing agricultural products each year. And when you look at their trade balance, in minusing their exports and imports on agriculture, I would say they have a trade deficit of about $117 billion. So in markets like that, South Africa has a place to play. And as a country, we're already a net exporter where we are exporting about half of what we produce each year, just over $13 billion. What's blocking our participation, though, in China is one, relatively higher import tariffs. Take wine, for example. South African wine in China faces import tariff of about 14%. Competitors like Australia and Chile are at 0%. And you can go across the fruits and the other products. And these countries have trade agreements, which South Africa doesn't. And secondly, there is also some phytosanitary barriers that South Africa faces there that have to do with the way products are handled or produced and the quality aspects. That's the phyto issues that we face. And these are things that I think South African authorities with the Chinese authorities needs to eye on the map so that we can begin to see a deeper trade with China, while at the same time ensuring that we retain some of the markets that as South Africa we currently participate in.
Yeah. Ben, as we wrap up, is there a light at the end of the tunnel as we talk about Africa's, agricultural side? One quick thing that you are optimistic about?
Oh, absolutely. We wouldn't be doing this job if we didn't believe that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. Look, we have a very, very bold mission statement, which is to achieve food security by 2030. And I certainly believe that it is achievable. And with all the various programs that are currently taking place, the initiatives that are driven by the African Development Bank and other key stakeholders in increasing food productivity on the African continent, when we look at these programs and initiatives, they provide hope for Africa. The only issue and the only constraint for me is the implementation. That's the only challenge that we are facing. And I do believe that with stakeholders like AGBIS and other key partners who can support these governments and these institutions in terms of implementation, we can certainly achieve that objective.
Well, gentlemen, I do hope the next time you and I have a conversation, we'll have something different to say around implementation. But thank you so much for your time. That is Wandile Sihlobo, who is the chief economist at AGBIS, and of course, Ben Leaka, who is the CEO of the African Agri Council. That is all we have lined up for you today. But of course, the conversation does not have to end here. You can now message us on the WhatsApp line, and our number is on your screen. If you've got a question, a comment, or suggestion, or you simply just want to share your thoughts, do drop us a message. That is it from the Power Lunch.